Sir Lewis Hamilton will take to the track in a Ferrari for the first time. How will he get on? We'll talk all of that and much more, including a ban on swearing this hour. You're listening to Kickoff on talkSPORT. I am Hugh Woozencroft. I'm alongside Lianne Sanderson, the former Lioness, and James Allen, Formula One a journalist from Autosport, joins us. Good evening, James.
How you doing, guys?
Nice Hi, James.
Thank you so much for being with us, James. Really, really appreciate it. And there's going to be a lot for us to discuss over the hour. So let's just get into it. 75 years of Formula One. So a landmark year to celebrate for the sport. I just wanted to start by asking really where you think Formula One currently sits in the global sporting landscape.
Wow, that's a really good question for you to start with. So listen, I think, when I was commentating on ITV with Martin Brundle for many years, in those days we used to do all the sort of studies of where F1 stood. And it was kind of a long way behind football. But it was kind of always ahead of rugby and cricket and all those sort of things. And that wasn't just in the UK, that was, around Europe and other places as well. I think what's happened is football's still the dominant sport, clearly. But what's happened with Formula One is it's really exploded in the US, particularly, which it wasn't a success there really up until, I would say, about 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm sure we'll come on to talk about why. And then the other thing is it's really exploded amongst younger audiences and female audiences. So what I see now I've been doing this for over 30 years. And what I see now when I go to Grand Prix, whether it's Silverstone or it's Austin, Texas, or wherever it might be, is a much younger crowd that are at the races. And a lot of, as I say, younger female fans who have just discovered the sport through Drive to Survive, through the social media being opened up by F1's owners, Liberty Media. And it's just kind of being reinvented, I would say, as a sport for a kind of a new generation. And that can only be a good thing. You've still got the kind of the sort of 50-year-old blokes in anoraks that still like Formula One because it is the ultimate expression of motorsport. But I would say at a time when we were all getting a little bit concerned that with the sort of drive to, sustainability and whether Formula One just looked like conspicuous consumption, and it was going to get phased out. It's actually quite the reverse. It's become, very fashionable. It's become cool again. And it's making so much money at the moment. It's just incredible.
James, I want to pick up on something you just said there. The event, obviously, at the O2 the other day. I mean, the Drive to Survive documentary, I'm not a massive Formula One fan. I like it. I've been to a number of events in Monaco and Silverstone. But, does that typify where the Formula One is out? I mean, when Christian Horner went out on the stage, he got booed. I don't think I've ever seen a Formula One event like that before.
No, I think that's absolutely right, Lianne. I mean, it's never been done before. They've never had a season launch with all, 10 teams and all 20 drivers. And in fact, you have to sort of go back quite a while since Formula One, even any of the teams, has done a launch like that. The only one I can think of that compares with that event at the O2 was back in the late 90s when McLaren switched between the two tobacco brands that had been sponsoring them to a new one. And the new one wanted to make a big splash and had an enormous budget and said, right, let's just blow the doors off this thing. And they hired the Spice Girls at the top of the peak of their power. It was around the time when Jerry Halliwell kissed the then Prince Charles. It was that sort of period, and it was just all going off. And it was Mick Hakkinen and David Coulthard with the drivers in those days, and they spent millions on that. But this has never been done before. This was, as I say, all 10 teams, all 20 drivers. And yes, it was about showing the new liveries, but it was really about kind of creating an event that was sort of, as Jack Whitehall said, not one for the purists. And I think the general feeling is it was a huge success. I mean, it was fantastic, and the Formula One are very proud of the people that sort of tuned in around the world. It seemed to have had a great audience, and I think the question now is whether they'll do it again. Whether they do it again in London at the O2, or maybe take it on the road. Why not launch the season in Madrid? Why not launch it in maybe even in the Middle East? I mean, you've got all this boxing coming up at the weekend. You can just imagine the Saudis wanting to have the season kickoff in Riyadh. How about that?
Yeah, absolutely fantastic event, and it was the prelude, hopefully, to an epic season as well. I wonder what you think about the upcoming season, and tell us a little bit more about regulation changes coming into 2026 and whether that might mean that this season teams are using it really to prepare for that big change in the sport.
Well, I think you put your finger on it there, Hugh, that 2026 looms very large for Formula One this year. And that's because we're at the end of a set of rules. And what always happens in Formula One, when you don't have a great deal of change in the regulations from year to year, is the cars get closer and closer together. And we saw that last season. The second half of last year, there was only one of 4 or 5 different teams and drivers that could win Grand Prix, which is obviously exactly what you want. It's a bit like the Premier League at the moment. You know, you look at the game that Villa gave Liverpool yesterday. I mean, that was unbelievable, high level, you know, really competitive stuff. But it doesn't look like the league table. The gap between them, you know, would tell you that it should have been Liverpool should have won that game. So, and I think that's what's happening in Formula One, is that the cars are all going to be really close together this year, because next year is a huge rule change, and therefore people are not you've got a cost control in the sport. It's a bit like you've got the financial fair play in football, or PSA, and it means the teams aren't allowed to spend more than 140 million a year. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but that's nothing compared to what the big teams used to spend. And so basically you're restricted to where you can spend your money. So a lot of them are putting their money on next year's car, and then they're not spending too much on this year's car. What does it all mean? It means the cars will be even closer together this year. So I actually think, and then maybe this is one for your season preview, is I actually think this will be the closest season in Formula One in recent history.
And James, talking of changes, the 2024 season, we saw all the teams unchanged. Now, going into this season, we're seeing Sainz go over to Williams, but ultimately Sir Lewis Hamilton. It did seem weird, didn't it, after 12 years of Mercedes in the red kit, like with Ferrari. But I think a lot of people are really excited for this one. How do you see it going with him at Ferrari now?
It's so interesting, Lianne. I mean, when you have great drivers in Formula One, and Hamilton follows in the footsteps of people like Fernando Alonso, people like Michael Schumacher, Ayrton Senna, Alain Prost, and those guys. There was always the lure that at some point, if they didn't start their career or have championship success with Ferrari, at some point there would be the lure of driving the red car. And Schumacher went for it, Prost went for it, Alonso went for it. Senna never did. They had conversations, but he never actually drove for Ferrari. But Hamilton, it was always going to happen sooner or later that he would feel that pull to go and drive the red car for the final few years of his career. And it's brilliant for the sport. It's absolutely transformative for the sport, because he's the biggest name, he's the biggest star, and even though he's 40 years old, which is a heck of an age in any elite sport, he's in great shape. Excuse me. And the thing with Lewis is that he's all about the energy and the kind of motivation. It's amazing he's been able to keep going as long as he has at the level he's at. But you can tell just from the way he's conducting himself, the way he speaks, that he's kind of this fresh energy he's got by changing teams is really invigorating him. And, he's going to need to be at the top of his game, because he's up against, in the same car, Charles Leclerc, who has been a bit up and down, I would say, in his career, but is unbelievably fast, particularly in qualifying. And I think what we'll see this year is that Hamilton will struggle to beat Leclerc in qualifying. So he might be starting behind him on the grid more often than not this year. But Hamilton is still, I think, pound for pound, the fastest, or if not equally the fastest, with Verstappen over a race distance, 300 kilometers. So I think you'll see a kind of, I wouldn't say tortoise and hare, but it's going to be quite ding dong. And I wouldn't want to be the person calling the shots on the pit wall for Ferrari, because Hamilton will be wanting one thing and Leclerc will be wanting to defend his position, and it could get quite tasty quite quickly. But it's a huge challenge for Lewis to be trying to beat a guy in his peak years when Lewis is in his 40s. It's going to be one of the great stories of the year, I think. We
are going to talk Lewis Hamilton in much more depth from half past as well. So we're going to talk about some of the
keep our powder dry then.
We're going to come to some of the subplots when it comes to that move to Ferrari, and also what it means for the sport as a whole from half past. So Ferrari fans, Lewis Hamilton fans, stay tuned for that. But he is one of the elder statesmen out there on the paddock now, and I wanted to discuss one of the younger ones, 19-year-old Briton coming in at Haas, Ollie Bearman, and what his future might be. Let's hear from Esteban Ocon, who's been discussing the youngster.
We just had a week, together in New York, and it was great to know Ollie. He's a great prospect of the future for Formula One, and such a fun character. He's a very kind guy outside of the car, and then he's very competitive for sure. So, that's a lot of fun to be around him. And we talk a lot about technical things. He knows a lot about Formula One already. He's very impressive on the technical knowledge. So, we are going to be working well together to try and make the team progress.
Esteban Ocon there, a teammate of Ollie Bearman at Haas. So could he be the next Lewis Hamilton? How good is this youngster, James?
Well, good question. I mean, he was a finalist in our Autosport Young Driver of the Year award, which is a kind of talent competition that we've run for many years. It brought through Jenson Button, Lando Norris, George Russell, and Bearman was a finalist in that, but he didn't win it. And that was probably a little bit about consistency and stuff during the 2 days of the evaluations. He's had a pretty good career in the junior categories. He's got a huge amount of talent, and he's extremely well prepared. I mean, he jumped into the Ferrari at very short notice last year in Jeddah, race 3, when Carlos Sainz, who was then with Ferrari, got appendicitis. And Bearman was there as a reserve driver. And that's the whole role, is if something happens to one of your lead drivers, you put the reserve in. So, but it's a very fast street circuit, Jeddah, and he'd never driven it. Well, he'd driven it in an F2 car, but he'd never driven it in a Formula One car before. And so it was a huge ask, and he had a brilliant performance, finished 7th. And that really put him on the map. And it was pretty much a few months later that Haas kind of tried him out in a couple of practice sessions and eventually gave him a drive for this year. So the answer to your question is, I think with all the rookies, it's going to be about finding consistency. It's really hard to be consistent when you're still learning your craft in Formula One. And as I said before, it's going to be very, very close. So if you make even a small mistake, you drop a 1/10 of a second, you're going to lose grid positions, etc. It's going to be like that this year. So I think Ollie will have probably a reasonably up and down season. I think he'll have some high points. I think he'll have some low points. Will he beat Ocon in terms of across the season in points? I mean, Ocon's a pretty experienced driver, but he too is a driver that needs to find some consistency. So I think they're going to be one of the very interesting storylines of this year. But one thing I do know about Ollie is he's very smart, and he will learn a lot from Ocon, and he'll learn a lot from the team principal. There is a Japanese guy called Ayo Komatsu, who's a really, really good leader. And I think it could be a good home for Ollie to really develop. He's got a couple of years as well, so he's not under massive pressure this year.
It's going to be interesting to see him out there. We'll be keeping a close eye on another young British talent making their way into Formula One.
talkSPORT Drive with Andy Goldstein, Monday to Friday afternoon from 4 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.